Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Linda Odor-Noah, and I work at Oxfam International on international financial institutions and public services. I am and have been a member of PERC for several years. PERC is the Privatisation in Education Human Rights Consortium, who are responsible for gathering us here today. I have the great privilege of welcoming you all to this webinar titled Demystifying Education Public-Private Partnerships, What Every Policymaker Should Know. So why are we here today and why is this important? This is basically a timely paper and discussion given the global challenges in the sector. We've heard it all before. 250 million children out of school, a global learning crisis, domestic education budgets under strain, and international aid to education also shrinking. But the main reaction to this reality, however, has been a global polity seeking out private capital and private solutions to address these pressing challenges. These calls seem to be getting even louder now. In fact, for those of you who might have been following the financing for development process, you'd have seen in the zero draft explicit calls to scale up the use of market instruments such as private equity and so on. But what we at the consortium and others have found out is that turning to commercial actors or market-oriented solutions for essential service delivery has serious implications, and often the story around these impacts is only partially told. As such, today with this webinar, we hope to revisit the evidence and journey through key questions and considerations that policymakers must reflect on in such pressing times. With me today, we have a great lineup of speakers, including from civil society, academia, the unions, and the UN, all who will be sharing their different perspectives on this issue. But before we go to them, I'd like to remind you that we have interpretation available in French and Spanish. Please find the interpretation button at the bottom of your screens. Some of you might find it under the More tab, which is 3 dots at the bottom of your screen. We will also have a chance for Q&A, but please do pop in your questions into the Q&A box and they will be attended to. And you may also introduce yourselves in the chat box or feel free to provide other comments in there as well as we progress through the webinar. Without taking much more time, I'd like to open up the floor to the authors of this great paper. Let's welcome Frank Adamson and Angela Tanija. Over to you, Frank.
Great. Thank you, Linda. And welcome, everyone. So happy to see so many different folks from around our planet on a call today of an issue of imports. I'm going to try to use the technology right now and share my screen. Let's see. That worked. Okay, so let's see which screen is being shared. Can you all see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes, good. Thank you. Great. So welcome all. And so why are we here today? So we've got the two different publications. We're releasing today a policy brief and we're releasing a position paper. And our goal here is to provide an informational tool for policymakers. And the reason we have two papers is I always tell my students, you know, it's harder to write short than long. So we started writing short and then we wrote a long position paper, which has a lot of the evidence that we provide. And the policy brief summarizes that evidence into a shorter version. So what are we doing here? We've got three different scenarios that we present in these papers. The first scenario is for policymakers that are entering a PPP. The second scenario is for those that are already engaged in a PPP. And the third scenario is for policymakers that are considering investing more in public education. So this has truly been a team effort. You can see our authors at the top, and then we've had over 20 contributors, including we have our authors. Angela is presenting with me today. And I want to say a thank you a special thank you to PERC and the coordinator, Alice, and all of the fellows that put so much work into this. And we've got over 50 endorsing institutions and organizations for the policy brief itself. So let's jump in. What are PPPs? So if you ask a different person about what a PPP is, you'll probably get a slightly different answer. But PPPs exist across sectors, but in this case, we're going to talk about public-private partnerships in the education sector. And we define PPPs here as the long-term contractual arrangements where the private sector provides infrastructure, assets, and services traditionally funded and managed directly by governments. So where can you find the types of organizations that would be PPPs? Well, we've got a handy little chart for you. So if you look at the private, so that's private finance and private provision, you'll see private schools, homeschooling. And the public-private are vouchers, charter schools, contract schools, and then also user fees and student loans are public provision, but privately funded. And that's really those two boxes where we're mainly concerned today. And of course, we could just do it in the public way with public schools and universities. So why are we focusing on policymakers? Policymakers have a lot of responsibilities. They have legislative responsibility. They write our policy. They have an oversight responsibility. They evaluate and monitor the different facets of PPPs. They are responsible for budget and finance, allocating funds. They're responsible for representation. They represent us, the public, as constituents, and they're also advocates. They can champion for higher quality public education. Too fast. So going on to scenario number one, this slide refers to the first scenario in the report when the policymakers are considering getting into a PPP. So here we look at 5 different rationales given for PPPs, and we recognize that in practice, as Mauro Moschetti mentioned in his report feedback, that some of these rationales can be used post facto when policymakers have other reasons or incentives. So meaning they can just say after the fact, this is why I did it. But we're treating it as, okay, this is what you might say when you're going to go in. So the first rationale, the PPPs are more efficient and save government resources. PPP's advocates argue that the private sector's more frugal approach can do more with the same resources, provide greater value for money, and the private sector entities bring additional technical expertise. Well, the reality is that education PPPs, are not a panacea for limited budgets because they have misaligned incentives, they cut corners, they increase costs, and they risk creating long-term obligations. For instance, the primary goal of private sector partners is typically profit, whereas the public sector's goal is to provide high-quality public education to all. So to achieve the profit, PPPs often use different cross-cutting measures, and they actually sometimes cost more than the public procurement. As a reminder, for all of the details on these rationales and realities, I refer you to the longer policy brief and the longer position paper. Rationale number 2 is that PPPs can reach geographies and students that the state cannot. Under this rationale, governments struggle to provide enough schools, so the private schools should open to fill that need. The reality is that PPPs harm educational equity and they exacerbate inequality. Education PPPs often recruit the cheapest to educate students while discriminating against those with additional educational needs. They often fail to bring students into education and leave the government schools with students with the highest educational needs. Rationale number 3 is that PPPs can address the learning crisis through innovation, disrupt the status quo of government funded and maintained and operated systems. But the reality is that the PPPs do not deliver better results. They neglect critical quality issues, and they in fact discourage pedagogic innovation. Why? Because PPPs cut costs by diminishing the teacher profession. They tend to favor traditional education approaches over true experimentation, which can actually require more investment. Rationale 4 is that PPPs are rapidly scalable because private providers can theoretically respond more quickly and flexibly than the slower public system. They can bypass existing restrictions, unionization or employment laws, politicization, and corruption allegedly inherent in the public system. The reality is that the quest for rapid scaling creates multiple problems for the system, including a lack of meaningful community consultation and difficulty maintaining quality at scale. For these reasons, PPPs often don't scale even if they claim they will. Rationale 5 is that private schools are more accountable since they directly respond to fee-paying parents. Parents actively choose private schools, and governments must respect and support this preference. The reality is that PPPs may be a Trojan horse for privatization, and that introducing school choice, fails to improve accountability. Parental choice can actually reinforce class and racial disparities because parents have different access to information and capacity to use that information, thus reinforcing the inequities that PPPs claim to rectify. So now I'm going to pass the shift over to our next speaker, Angela.
So the next scenario is we already are can you move the slide? Yeah, so we are in a scenario where the policy maker finds him or herself in a public-private partnership, about which he or she has serious suspicions and doubts. So therefore, again, 5 points to consider. Firstly, look deeper at the impact on equity. Is the PPP permitted to select students? Are there mechanisms for screening? If yes, then this requires, maybe some of the claimed results are fundamentally because of that. From an equity lens, is the way that the education is delivered culturally appropriate, both in terms of processes and materials? Are they permitted to make a profit? As in, not just on paper, but in reality, do their accounts really show profit making, or because often, irrespective of what the legal status of not for profit may be, there would still be profit made in practice. Can additional fees be levied, or which includes quote unquote informal parental contributions? Is there actual support for marginalized students from marginalized background? Look at the class composition, look at the extent to which children with disability are faring well, are the racialized groups welcome, etc. Are the logistics and infrastructure uh, appropriate for the needs of these students? Is there explicit discrimination against persons with disability, racialized groups, others? Is instruction in the mother tongue? And of course, capture instances when students who have enrolled are actually displaced from public schools, and therefore much more nuanced understanding from an equity lens is critical. Second, are they able truly to keep costs down without cutting corners? As in, are they therefore truly adhering to the laws and requirements as laid down by law, be it the national, federal, local, whatever level? Are they able to truly support teachers? How is so-called impact measured? Is it just standardized tests, or is it the holistic set of outcomes that is being captured? Is impact captured specifically for marginalized groups? Because on average, especially if there is skimming, there may be good results, but how are those who are most likely to require education intervention and support faring in this PPP? Is whatever data available actually shared with parents, and there's a mechanism for social accountability? Is the comparison just overall project against project, or is it being compared with the public sector? taking into consideration the differences in the possible socioeconomic status of students in the PPP schools versus the general population. Is this, if there is still the data seems to suggest it's relatively better, is this improvement because of the extra funds that are available in the PPP, or is the PPP itself doing better? And also from costs, is make sure that no negative impacts for how is it ensured that the public schools themselves are not negatively affected through the PPP, the larger pool of government schools. Third, how is accountability ensured? Does the PPP provide for clear penalties uh, in case uh, and liability in case the PPP doesn't deliver? Is there power to modify the contract in case of emergencies? Is this an what mechanisms are in place to address corruption, lobbying, etc. by the private provider? But then it's not just the policy that's important, but also the enforcement and the capacity, which is important. So from that point of view, does the policy maker's own slash government have adequate capacity, both in terms of systems, but also the staff and the resources that's necessary to ensure enforcement of said accountability? Lastly, also parental role in this is critical and needs to be strengthened and is often lacking in private provision. Ensure transparency, public disclosure is essential. An open information flow is essential for overall for the PPP as a whole, but also largely more wider, and there should be mechanisms for dialogue. Address power asymmetries. Yes, powerful entities like DFIs or private sector or philanthropies may be pushing for a PPP, but to address this, build alliances, ensure peer learning, involve civil society, teachers unions, parent-teacher associations, community and media platforms to build power to address those power imbalances that may exist in a PPP. What does that involve? Possibly renegotiating some of the contracts. One would need to obviously be aware of legal implications, but if necessary, that is one way to follow. But of course, look at public alternatives, which takes us to the scenario 3. Which is what are the alternatives? Common sense, build the public alternative, build the capacity of the public system, invest in teachers, re, uh, ensure that the appropriate regulatory and enforcement mechanisms are in place, and also push for adequate financing in education. Next, when it comes to donors, uh, they should cease the promotion and funding of PPPs, uh, ensure that social services like education are not included in all financialization and private sector provision related policies that might exist, and cease funding for it, certainly for commercial private schools, especially be it by donors or by governments. Is there a last slide, or was this it? So in conclusion, therefore, what does this whole presentation leave us with? The policymakers need to evaluate, truly look at the functioning of PPPs critically, and remember that public provision is where the true alternative lies and where the solution lies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Angela. My name is Sam Abrams, and I'm the director of the International Partnership for the Study of Educational Privatization, anchored at the University of Colorado Boulder. And we now have Tony Verger, who's going to present some empirical findings about PPPs. Take it away, Tony.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation. I will try to share the screen, but I don't think I have permission for that. So maybe I will ask.
Yeah, we'll share your PowerPoint. I'll share it 1 second.
Yeah, if you can share it for me, would be perfect. So I am in the middle of a visit to a school, so this is why I have these fancy guitars on my background.
Ruth, could you share it? It's not letting me do it. Oh, actually, maybe now. Can you see the screen now?
It's loading.
It's coming, but
You should see it now.
Yes.
yeah, it's working. So yeah, as Sam said, I will provide with some insights from empirical research on PPPs in education. I would like to start by highlighting, if we go to the next slide, that the expansion of private enrollment in education is a globalizing phenomenon. So the enrollment, this is for primary schools, but we see a similar picture for secondary schools too, is a phenomenon that has been increasing since the 90s in all world regions, I would say, and in some of them in a very accelerated way in the last 20 years or so. And this expansion of the private sector has not only been driven by market forces, it has been driven by the involvement of the public sector, of the state, usually under the form of public-private partnerships, which is the phenomenon we are talking about here today. If we go to the next slide, we will see that PPPs are a very broad category. So when we talk about PPPs, at least from a policy perspective, I think it's important that we unpack this broad category in different types of policy arrangements, different types of policy frameworks, and in a way, I think that we can classify PPPs according to the level of intensity of the market mechanism. So when the World Bank is talking about an emerging or a moderate PPP, we are usually talking about an arrangement in which market forces are not central by design in the PPP. Here we are talking about countries that are giving some subsidies to private schools or that contract out the school provision to private providers. Then we have other forms of PPPs more engaged, in which here there is a design of a policy that is aiming to promote higher levels of autonomy in part of the school provision, usually funded through public monies, but privately managed. Here we are usually talking about the model of charter schools in the US, academies in England. And then we have what we call a more radical, let's say, model of public-private partnership, in which the market mechanism is more central, in the sense that schools, whether public or private, are funded through a voucher system, which means that they receive funding according to the demand in a way that promotes much more competition between providers. So if you click the next slides, you will see that, yeah, I am categorizing these three policies in three main mechanisms, so public subsidies, charter schools, and vouchers. If we go to the next slide, we will see the findings of a scoping literature review we did with Mauro Moschetti and Clara Fondevila, where we show that PPPs and particularly some forms of PPPs are particularly problematic from an equity perspective. So if in terms of student achievement, PPPs usually generate mixed results, in terms of research reporting on the equity effects of PPPs usually show that no matter which is the category of the policy framework, is usually generating negative effects. The voucher programs look paradoxical here, but vouchers can be universal, which are those that are promoting much more market competition, and targeted vouchers. So targeted vouchers are not as negative as universal vouchers in terms of equity. And if we go to the next slide, we summarize this funding by showing that, yeah, most studies on PPPs show how these frameworks are highly problematic in terms of equity, but especially those that promote more market-like dynamics, higher levels of school choice, that allow private schools to select the students, that allow schools to add on tuition fees that usually charge to families, or that incorporate the possibility of these private providers to be for profit, are those more problematic in terms of equity goals. In terms of student achievement, I think that here is important to look at what PISA data is telling us about educational systems with more private funded provision. And here what we find is that learning outcomes, all things being equal, in public schools are very similar to those in private schools. And sometimes in several subjects like math, or those that are being evaluated by the OECD through PISA, public schools outperform, all things being equal, private schools. And those educational systems with more private schools generally exhibit a lower average of performance achievement in reading, mathematics, and science. So again, student achievement goals are not, or the promises of higher levels of student achievement in the context of PPPs, at least in the context of OECD countries, are not being met. If we go to the next slide, I explain a bit more why some PPP schools are doing better than public schools, and it's usually when these schools are allowed to select the students, or in targeted vouchers, we also see some improvement of performance, because precisely targeted vouchers allow some level of student selection. This is why in the last years, a lot of international organizations, national governments, but also civil society organizations are putting a lot of emphasis on the importance of trying to regulate PPPs from different perspectives. So once you have a PPP framework in place, it's important to look at the public regulation of this PPP to try to address some of these equity issues. If we go to the next slide,
Tony, just in the interest of time, if we can, 2 more minutes.
Sorry again?
That'd be great, thanks.
How long did you say?
Just 2 more minutes in the interest of time.
Perfect. Yeah, because I want to highlight, and this is again some work we have done with other colleagues, in this case, Adrián Zancajo, Clara Fondevila, and Xavier Bonal. This is a background paper for the UNESCO GMR on non-state actors in education. What we highlight in this paper is that there are 3 very sensitive areas of public regulation concerning public-private partnerships. The first one, if we go to the next slide, is related to the authorization of private providers. So here is important that public regulation avoids the concentration of PPP schools in certain areas, because this is a source of school segregation, and especially to avoid that for-profit providers are allowed to operate under PPP frameworks. If we go to the next slide, there is a second area that is key, that is the school funding. So if a PPP has to work a bit better for equity goals, it's important that PPP schools are not able to charge school fees to families, because these school fees will act as barriers to a school access. And this will also generate some levels of student segregation in schools. Some measures that are important here is to make sure that education is free in all type of school publicly funded, and also, if possible, in context of educational inequalities, that schools that are serving the most disadvantaged population, they have higher levels of public funding through different formula funding mechanisms. And the last dimension, if we go to the next slide, is related to a school choice. So in context where a school choice is allowed, it's important to centralize the school admission process, especially to try to avoid that schools are able to select their intake, because this will generate some unfair competition between providers, and also as a way to reduce the information asymmetries that we know that affect different social groups. Just to conclude, we go to the last slide. I want to highlight how systematically educational research shows that public-private partnerships in education generate social equity challenges, that many states are trying to address these challenges by more strict public regulation in terms of school choice, educational funding, and the authorization of private providers. These reforms need to be systemic, in the sense that if you only focus on one dimension, probably you are not going to be able to address these equity effects. So reforms need to be systemic. But also at the same time, we need to be aware of the fact that these regulatory reforms are relatively recent. We don't have empirical results about their impact, whether they are able to address these equity issues. And there are some reasons to be skeptical about it, in the sense that what we know is that PPPs, by design or de facto, they usually generate more performative school ethos, competition between schools, but also between families, and the organization of particular interest. And we know that these factors can go against the intentions of these public regulations, but definitely this is an area that is definitely promising, and more research needs to be done in the following years.
Yeah, thank you for your
attention.
Absolutely. More research always. That big picture is extremely helpful that Tony just provided. Now we're going to move on to Rola Mumne. We'll be speaking in French to address the intergovernmental organizations and the relationship toward PPPs. Rola Mumne en français.
Je vous remercie. Vous m'entendez? Très bien, très bien. Je vous remercie. Je vous remercie pour l'invitation. J'aimerais tout d'abord féliciter pour le rapport, et qui sont voilà, d'une grande richesse d'enseignement. J'aimerais apporter donc un peu la perspective de l'UNESCO. J'aimerais dire que le rapport reflète les orientations stratégiques de l'UNESCO en ce sens que le rôle des acteurs non étatiques dans l'éducation c'est important de mettre en évidence vraiment ces orientations sont importantes pour mettre en évidence l'importance de concilier innovation, équité et inclusion pour soutenir le droit universel à une éducation de qualité. Donc, en ce sens, voilà, ces apports reflètent les orientations stratégiques de l'organisation. L'organisation reconnaît la diversité des acteurs non étatiques, notamment les entreprises privées, les ONG, les organisations, les institutions religieuses qui jouent un rôle croissant dans de nombreux contextes éducatifs. L'essor de l'éducation privée et des PPP peut enrichir l'offre éducative en complément de l'éducation publique. Cependant, il est crucial que ces initiatives soutiennent plutôt que remplacent les efforts du secteur public. Les PPP peuvent générer des effets positifs, on l'entend souvent, en fonction des contextes, notamment en augmentant le nombre d'écoles disponibles et en répondant à des besoins spécifiques des populations. Néanmoins, il est indispensable d'établir des mécanismes rigoureux pour garantir que ces initiatives demeurent inclusive et alignée avec les droits, en particulier pour les groupes vulnérables, et qu'elle ne contribue pas à exacerber les inégalités sociales, on l'a entendu. Des garde-fous doivent être mis en place pour éviter la création d'un système éducatif à deux vitesses et pour assurer que les PPP ne diminuent pas l'engagement de l'État envers l'éducation publique. Alors, bien que les PPP soient parfois présentés comme une solution innovante et flexible, et ça a été vu, leur mise en œuvre doit être accompagnée d'un suivi rigoureux pour éviter les coûts imprévus et les déséquilibres financiers. Dans les zones où les infrastructures éducatives sont limitées, les PPP peuvent améliorer l'accès à l'éducation, mais il est crucial de garantir leur accessibilité universelle et de prévenir les inégalités dans les qualités des services fournis. Par ailleurs, l'évaluation de leur impact nécessite des données fiables, comme l'a souligné le rapport mondial de l'UNESCO de suivi de l'éducation. Une coordination efficace et un soutien continu sont nécessaires pour maximiser l'impact positif. Des mécanismes renforcés de transparence et de responsabilité sont également indispensables pour veiller au respect des principes d'équité, de qualité, d'accessibilité dans les partenariats éducatifs. Le développement des PPP dans l'éducation requiert dès lors des régulations adaptées et des normes minimales afin de prévenir une commercialisation excessive et de garantir une éducation de qualité respectant les principes fondamentaux d'équité et d'accès universel. L'UNESCO rappelle que l'État demeure le garant principal de l'éducation en veillant à offrir un accès à une éducation de qualité pour tous, sans discrimination et dans un cadre clairement inclusif. Cela inclut l'établissement et l'application de normes claires pour les acteurs privés, comme détaillé dans une étude récente de l'UNESCO de l'année dernière. Le rapport mondial de suivi sur l'éducation met également en lumière l'importance d'un cadre réglementaire solide pour encadrer les acteurs non étatiques, tout en soulignant que ces efforts doivent s'accompagner d'une volonté politique forte et de ressources suffisantes pour en garantir l'efficacité. Les défis des États pour mettre en œuvre une réglementation efficace sont importants, notamment en raison de contraintes financières, mais aussi institutionnelles. Et un renforcement des capacités réglementaires permet de s'assurer que les acteurs privés respectent les normes établies. Enfin, j'aimerais insister sur le fait que le renforcement des systèmes éducatifs publics reste une priorité incontournable. Cela passe par des investissements accrus dans la formation des enseignants, les infrastructures et l'amélioration des conditions de travail. Le soutien des bailleurs de fonds internationaux est crucial pour aider les gouvernements à consolider et renforcer leur système public, comme souligné par ailleurs dans de nombreuses études de l'UNESCO, tout en veillant à ce que le développement des PPP ne se fasse pas au détriment de l'attention portée au renforcement du système éducatif public. Je vous remercie.
OK. Merci, Rola. Thank you very much, Rola. And now we're going to move on to Gabriela Bonilla to address the impact of PPPs on teachers. Thank you, Gabriela.
Thank you, Sam, y buenos días a todas y todas. I will be speaking in English, so I apologize to the people listening in Spanish. I hope the translation is working for them. So from Education International, we see ourselves reflected, first of all, in this brief. We have been discussing how public-private partnerships in education many times work as an instrument of private control over the public goods, private and business control over the public decisions. Many times, public-private partnerships do not seek efficiency in services of education, but rather they're generating a network of private bureaucracy and business around the right to education. And we know in many countries, public-private partnerships are nourished by the neoliberal myth that all what comes from state, all that is public has failed or is failed. So the constant attack on the public sector, the reputational attacks against teachers and public workers, they come in handy for business in PPPs. From our point of view, we have seen there where governments do not wish to respect freedom of association, do not wish to guarantee collective bargaining, we will see the increase in some either outsourcing of the implementation of the education policy. We will see the increase of the whole voucher system that Tony was describing recently. And even where there are governments who do respect the rule of law, we will see that these governments have also normalized the outsourcing of the education policies. And this creates a constant transfer of public funds, but also of state tasks, state responsibilities to private groups, to foundations, to religious groups. In the global south, the influence of religious groups, it's being clear in education. So we should raise a couple of questions. Why are we seeing so many cuts in education? And at the same time, we're seeing the increase of the transfer of funds to PPPs. So there is a constant capture of resources, of public resources by business groups. In Latin America, where I'm speaking from, we realized that from 2018 to 2022, in 10 countries, there were at least 80 non-governmental or non-state actors and religious groups providing services in teacher training, providing services in curricula design. And Frank mentioned this at the very beginning. Frank talked about the myth of thinking that PPPs can deliver with less funds. But the truth is, we have seen they do not deliver, but they do profit many times from public funds. So there are cuts. We're lacking the debate on tax justice, and we're lacking the debate on why so many governments feel so comfortable transferring their tasks, outsourcing their tasks. A state should guarantee the public policies, and PPPs are not obliged to guarantee many times. For the business sector in education, many of these private partnerships represent a unique vehicle to capture resources from public budgets. And without these PPPs, many private sectors, many foundations would have never been able to reach some business niches. So we see how they're creating business opportunities in the standardized teaching training, the standardized test, and now what they're calling the digital alphabetization of teachers. Finally, we from Education International have talked with our unions, our teachers' unions. They know that education policy is not neutral. It is in dispute because the very model of our societies is in dispute. The future of labor rights, the mere sense of development, of government, of human rights is in dispute at this moment. And Angela also pointed in her talk the need of invest in teachers. And we want to also raise the issue that United Nations, they developed these 59 recommendations on the teacher professions. And that document made us go back to the ILO technical meeting from 2021, where there were concerns raised about what happens when PPPs are the employees or teachers, what is going on when private sector is employing teachers, what is going on with the freedom of association, what is going on with the right to collective bargaining. And from Education International, we want to raise the importance of having teachers from their knowledge, from the knowledge they build every day in the classroom, having teachers being part of the design of the definition of public policy in education and of our pedagogical mediation and strategies. We see a danger in calling for private funds and speculative financing. On the one hand, we know investors and trust funds are not obliged to guarantee their permanence in any country, in any community. They're not obligated to guarantee the stability of funding. When there are calls to private funds and speculative financing and trust funds to come and guarantee the finance for education, we are avoiding the main discussions that we need to arrive, which is tax justice, and which is also the forgiveness of debts for our countries. We know speculative markets and trust funds, they work in base of standardized tests and collecting data and results. If we open the door for these kind of speculation funds to finance education, this will create greater pressure on teachers, on schools, on education systems to function as systematic data creators, to compete, to be attractive for the donors and for the funders. So we know there is a danger here. We need—
On that note, Gabrielle,
yes,
if we can
and
wrap up in the interest of time, we have some questions, and that's a good place to stop because you really did want to address PPPs and their impact on teachers.
Just to say the last idea for all of us, to stay with this idea, we want to have allies, we want to have partnerships, but to defend tax justice, to defend the forgiveness of public debt, and to defend the state as the responsible for public education, because that is the base of the rule of law. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you, Gabriella, and sorry for the time constraints. That's the way, unfortunately, these things work. But we do have one question already up. Actually, I guess we have two. This is from Everleen Akic. From the analysis on PPP's progression over the years, Asia seems to have had the greatest increase in actualization compared to other regions. What accounts for this? Now, Tony, you answered this in the text. If you could answer it live, that would be great.
Okay, yeah, I got this question on the expansion of private provision in specific regions of the world. And the question was specifically regarding South Asia and West Asia. And these are countries where, because of demographic reasons, there has been an expansion of educational demand, not always covered through public provision and an increase in state capacity to provide and to plan and to build new public schools. So this has generated a lot of space for the emergence of so-called low-fee private schools. And in these particular countries, international donors have also been eager to support the organization of public-private partnerships, many times with low-fee private schools. And this has been also a driver to understand this expansion, a spectacular expansion of private provision in some of the world regions.
Yeah. So thank you, Tony, for that. This really has to do with capacity building in many respects. Obviously, the authors of this report are very concerned with a certain kind of predatory expansion of companies that are making money with scripted curricula. Some of these are for profit, as we know, in the underdeveloped world, and that's highly problematic. The next question we have is from Jose Antonio Gonzalez Guzman from Bolivia, and that concerns
Sam, can I?
Yeah, Frank,
can I just jump in real quick on this question?
Sure.
Because one thing that, looking into Pakistan and our colleagues in Nepal, another thing that's happening that's driving the private side is perception, right? There is a perception that the private schools are better, and that perception does not actually meet the reality, which is a big point in this report. And so, but that perception is driven heavily by media, by government officials themselves. So there's a disentangling here that this report is really trying to get to, the demystification and the uncovering of the realities that are actually underpinning the situation. So I just wanted to get to that point as well. I see Angela's hand is up.
Yeah, Frank, thanks for chiming in about that. So much of this, of course, is about messaging. And the right has understood this for a long time. There's a famous memo from Lewis Powell in the United States in 1971 concerning winning the messaging war. And this doesn't pertain just to the United States. It's an international phenomenon. Angela?
So as the Asian on the panel, thought I should, even if we're out of time, thought I should chime in anyway. In addition to what everyone has said, there is the element of social stratification and the history of caste and class in this region, with this perception of relative improvement, of relative private schools being relatively better off, being also driven by the fact that the upper class and upper caste families do not want their children to study in the same environment as lower caste poor children. So therefore, the segregation in the education system mirrors social segregation in society. So therefore, that is an added element that needs to be addressed. And after that, of course, when it comes to PPPs, the whole perception element takes over with if this is a system that is geared towards the rich and is favored by the rich, then it must be better.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. In terms of messaging, absolutely. And it has been a path to segregation for sure. We've seen that in many countries. To get to Jose Antonio Gonzalez Guzman's question, originating from policy in Bolivia, perhaps we can get somebody to address this in terms of getting Catholic schools to partner with the government, as has been the practice in Bolivia and many other countries. Any thoughts? From our panelists?
Maybe we can jump in from Education International. We have studied Bolivia, Colombia, Guatemala, where churches play a role, and actually international religious structures play a role in administrating public funds for administrating and providing educational services. What we have highly defend is actually like education, non-religious education, to allow a real diversity and inclusion inside the classroom. So we very strongly defend that the state guarantees secular curricula and secular education, because this really is what we're looking at secular education would guarantee all students and all teachers have the right to practice their religion instead of having some faiths be more represented or powerful over others. At this moment, there is important debate in Latin America, for example, regarding how public funds are going to religious groups who are not willing to implement the whole curricula, are not implementing human rights curricula or gender approach or diversity. So you have those contradictions. And I just want to say, the document that we're presenting here, the position paper that it's being discussed here, wants to help governments work with this evidence. But then also, we from the unions, we have the task to educate society, because it's students, it's their families who can suffer if the right to quality education is not properly guaranteed by the state. So there's also that other direction. We need people to know this better.
No, and what you're saying, Gabriella, applies so well in so many different countries. We have to be so concerned about co-option of the curriculum and inclusion of all types of people. And this is an issue, obviously, in religious schools in terms of barring people from, say, the LGBTQ community from enrollment or employment. This is a big problem. So there's an inclusion issue. Last question concerns France from Adrian. And Adrian knows there's a special character of public-private partnerships in France. In France, about 17% of students go to schools operated sous contrat, under contract. These schools do have to comply with national standards. They can't hire uncertified teachers. The curricula have to comport with national standards. Somebody from the LGBTQ community can't be barred from enrollment or employment. But Rola, you're positioned well to address this question, if you're still with us, about the role of public-private partnerships in France, and then we'll turn it over to Linda. Rola, do you have anything you want to say about France? And I think Rola, yeah.
Oui, merci. Alors, je vais être très bref. Oui, alors là, il est important d'assurer l'inclusion de tous les apprenants, de toutes les catégories avec les différents besoins spécifiques des apprenants. Donc l'inclusion et l'égalité des chances, l'égalité de traitement dans l'éducation est un des principes fondamentaux du droit à l'éducation, pour lesquels, comme vous le savez, l'UNESCO n'a de cesse de tenter de promouvoir, d'essayer aussi de manière générale, je ne passerai pas, je n'ai pas le temps de parler des détails, mais d'essayer de promouvoir auprès de ses États membres, essayer d'assurer le suivi continu pour savoir quelles sont les mesures qui sont prises. On a par exemple la consultation actuelle sur la Convention contre la discrimination dans le domaine de l'enseignement, qui est une convention qui cherche à encourager les États membres de l'UNESCO et les États parties à prendre des mesures également positives pour assurer l'égalité des chances, de manière positive également, et prendre les mesures nécessaires pour savoir quelles sont les mesures qui ont été prises par les pays pour améliorer la situation et pour aussi anticiper sur les besoins spécifiques. Donc, je veux dire, ça, c'est un exemple. C'est une consultation qui...
Pas maintenant. Nous n'avons pas assez de temps, malheureusement. We don't have enough time right now for an example. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. But France is a very interesting illustration of where the contracting does work differently. There are problems with it, no doubt. Rola, sorry to interrupt. It's just in the interest of time. Linda, please wrap up.
Thanks, Sam, and everyone for that very interesting discussion. I know we didn't have enough time to get into the details, but this isn't the end. We can continue talking to each other. Many important and salient points raised by our speakers. Our speakers reminded me that equity needs to remain at the heart of our decision-making and strategies. We must keep collecting evidence. Knowledge is, after all, political. And we must keep fighting the neoliberal myth that the public has failed and that the private is better, and many, many other great points from our speakers. policymakers. But as we end, I would like to underscore that education remains one of the most powerful weapons for changing the world. And so this is why us at PERC, we have stood for and continue to stand for public education for all. Public provision, when done right, is the most viable, equitable, accountable way of reaching and caring for all children, particularly the disadvantaged and the hardest to reach. It offers a chance at equal opportunity and builds empowered societies. Commercial provision or control, on the other hand, falls far short of this promise in many ways and will likely not address the needs of the 250 million children who are out of school today. So the prevailing challenges, the call for laser-focused commitment to investing in teachers, as our speakers have said, investing in education quality, and ensuring there's adequate regulation of the private education providers, as well as enough oversight of our public schools. As always, the money question does come up. Where will the money come from? And civil society has been putting forward those proposals, as was touched on during the webinar. We need to tax the rich and have progressive tax reforms. We need to reduce or eliminate debt. We need to deal with corruption and the waste of public resources. And all this is possible to do with and within our reach. So let's not focus on some of the flashier proposals being put forward and act on some of these recommendations. And so once again, we call on our policymakers to seize the promotion and funding of market-oriented education solutions and to redouble their efforts towards strengthening public education provision in the ways that have been mentioned. To our audience, we encourage you to join us in making these asks to your local policymakers. And please, we'd really love to engage in these discussions with you. So drop us a line and we'll definitely respond and stay in touch. This brings us to the end of our wonderful webinar. I'd like to thank the authors and contributors to the brief. I believe it will be a great platform for many more discussions on this topic. And to our speakers, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us and for sharing your candid thoughts on this issue. We thank you for supporting the fight for quality education for all. To Ruth and Alice, we thank you for all the hard work you have put in towards this launch. And to our audience, once again, thank you. We hope to see you all attend our future events. As a final request, we'd like to ask that you turn on your cameras for a very quick group photo, and then we can end the webinar. So if you could all just turn on your cameras, and then we will take a screenshot and end the webinar. Thank you once again.
I don't think actually participants can, Linda, so it's just going to have to be a picture of all of you here.
All
Yeah.
right. Maybe the
Okay.
speaker can wait.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
Goodbye. And good night.
Muchísimas gracias, compañeras. Un abrazo. Gracias.
Thank you, gracias. Hasta la próxima.